God, you are our foundation. God, you are everything that we have. You are the only thing that we can trust in. If we could go back into that chorus one more time. It's just striking me how distinct it is, the feeling of knowing when God is your only trust. Not when you can trust in anything in yourself, not when you can trust in anything that's manufactured, nothing that's of your own ability to manipulate or control. But if we build our life on God's love, he promises that he blesses us. So if we go back into that chorus one more time, sing it back. Yes, God. You alone. God, you're that foundation that in the middle of the floods that occur in our lives, in the middle of the places, the earthquakes, the natural disasters, the things that come in, you are the foundation that strengthens and it holds and it does not give way. It is a levee that does not break. It is nothing that can stop it. It's only in you, God. That love is that foundation. One more time. Yes, God. Not be shaken. If you don't mind giving a praise to God. We will not be shaken. Worship team, thank you so much. Oh my goodness. I had a very special request for that song or a few months ago. Whenever that song is sung, I can't get over how practical that is, how that's the request that we have before God, that he would build our life and that our love would be found on him and him alone. Woo! Listen. Brother George, you're bringing it over there. Man, can we give a hand for the worship team? Well, if you have not seen me before, don't know me, my name is Tyler. I'm one of the pastors here at Fountain of Life Covenant Church, and I'm thrilled to be up here today. We're continuing our Intimacy with God series for the past 5 or 6 weeks while Pastor G is on sabbatical, which by the way is wonderful for him. I'm sure he's being able to take those 11 months of the year that he is all invested, and letting the Lord use him, and taking that month to be able to rest and relax and let the Lord love him in that way. And so we're thankful that he gets that month off, and yeah, absolutely. And one of the other blessings too that I honestly have never encountered at another church, maybe it's just me, but the amount of people that we have in this church who can preach on a given Sunday, I mean, we're doing 6 weeks, and we are not having one person that is going to preach twice in those 6 weeks while Pastor G's gone. We get different voices from the community. We had the Courageous Woman of Faith series back in May. It's just, it's a true blessing here at Fountain of Life that we have, and that I don't want us to take for granted. Each person gets to bring a new perspective. And this series of intimacy with God, and how each of us find our own intimacy with God, and how intimacy comes, is great to have different perspectives on. So today I'm going to be continuing, and it is actually the first time that I am preaching back up here again since 2 years ago. First time in 2 years, back when I was an intern. If you remember that, 2 years ago, the nice 3-month-long internship, and I've actually been on staff now for a year already, which is quite unbelievable to me. So, and one of the first lessons that I was taught, I was taught 2 first lessons by Pastor G on the first day. Number 1, if black people are running, follow. That was lesson number 1. Don't ask questions. Don't try and reason it out. If you see white people running, don't follow them either. They're probably going the wrong way. see a black person running, go with them. I've not had to use that yet, but it's still in my head. One of the second lessons that Pastor G gave me at the beginning is that when you come up and you preach at this podium, there's a reason that it's clear glass. There's a reason that the podium is transparent. And it's not just that you can see my suit better. The reason the podium is transparent is because when you come up and preach, you are transparent. You bring your whole life, you bring yourself. Unfortunately, we have too many pastors these days preaching at people, not preaching at themselves and letting their lives be open in front. So today, if it's okay, I would like to be a little bit transparent with you. Is that cool? All right, the first piece of transparency I have to say is that I am a self-proclaimed recovering perfectionist. That's a laugh. Anybody else in here who agrees, who can say that I'm a self-recovering perfectionist? That has been one of the main narratives of my life, is that I want things to be perfect. I want the details to work out. I want to have it all figured out, and I want to appear to people like I have it all together, and I am perfect. See, the narrative that I have going on in my head that I've taught myself over the years, somehow, I've learned over the years, and I feel like is my narrative, is that in order to receive love, this is where we get into the intimacy part, in order to receive love, I have to be perfect for others. Unfortunately, that is the narrative that I play myself in my head. That's not healthy, that's not right, that's not good, that's not there, but we all have different narratives that we play in our heads of how we are supposed to receive love. And for me, my narrative is that if I am not perfect, if I don't come across as impressive, if I don't come across as someone who's able to do the right thing at all times, if I'm not someone who comes across as the most caring individual in the room, I feel like I've let someone else down. And I feel like I'm not worthy of love in that way. One of the distinct places as well, again, I said transparency, bringing my whole life, is that one of the places that I think my perfectionism has come out clearly, and it's actually been detrimental to myself and where I could open myself to, is in relationships. So that being transparent with you. When it comes to relationships, for me, I've spent my whole life, again, filling that narrative of trying to be perfect for someone else. And it works great for the first month or two. I'll tell you what, it really does. You can ask my parents, my family, the first month or two, wow, it's like, whoa, this is something different. And so I do my absolute best to deny myself everything in order to be a perfect person for someone else. I don't know if any of you all can feel the same or have done that in the same way, but what happens after the first 1 or 2 months, if that's been you? Well, you realize you're not perfect, and you realize you don't want to be perfect anymore because it's exhausting to try and have to be perfect all the time, to try and to feel like you have to be perfect at every moment for every other person in this world, and to feel like you can't share who you really are because you're too busy trying to be someone for someone else. One of the most distinct conversations I remember that challenged me on this, and first named it, I'm not sure I even understood what was going on, but one of my best friends in Chicago, his name's Tony, and we were sitting after a relationship went south, and it was after 2 months of me trying to be perfect, and we're just talking about the relationship. We're sitting in this coffee shop downtown, and he looks at me and he goes, "So, Tyler, what is your definition of love and intimacy? What does that mean for you? Because you've been trying all these different, what actually is love and intimacy for you?" I thought about it for a while, and I came up with this. When someone knows and sees everything about you, including your flaws, including all the pieces that you've hid, the pieces that you've said, "I don't want that to come out," the pieces that said, "I'm not good enough," everything that is going on inside of you, and someone still chooses you. Someone still wants to work with you. Someone still loves you in that situation. That's what feels like love and intimacy to me. You open and expose yourself. And then he said one of the most gut-wrenching phrases he's ever said. He said, "That's interesting that you say that, because you have spent your entire life actively trying to protect yourself from love. from intimacy with anyone. When it comes to friends, when it comes to everything, you have spent your entire life preventing yourself from being seen and known as anything less than perfect. And so in effect, you have prevented yourself from love your entire life. That hit me like a knife in the heart, and I was like, oh my gosh, that feels so resonant. That feels like it makes sense that that's what's going on, and get yourself a friend like that. First off, that's the first little piece of advice, is if you can have friends that can speak into your life and can call out those things in your life like that, those are friends that you hang on to. Those are the friends that you need in your life to be able to speak those things into your life. And so today, the topic that we're going through is intimacy at the end of your own resources. Intimacy when it's not you who gets to control how other people see you. Intimacy when it's not you who gets to manipulate. And we're talking about relationship with God here as well. To manipulate your relationship with God so that you appear perfect, you appear like you've got it together, that you can construct and control situations to fit exactly what you want, that you can manipulate God into thinking that intimacy is actually found through your own resources. I've titled the sermon, A Walk to Remember, partly because it's kind of catchy, if you've ever seen the movie. And I tried to ask my sisters, I looked at the passage and I talked to A Walk to Remember. I was like, is there anything in the movie that like kind of ties in with what I'm saying? They're like, no. So to be honest, it's a catchy title, it's something to remember. But the closest thing is that this passage culminates in a walk God has with Abram, and it's a walk to remember. So today, talking about a walk to remember. If you want to open up to Genesis 15, go ahead and open up in your Bibles, and while you are doing that, we're going to look over pretty much the whole chapter here. A few verses we're going to skip, but there's a little context that I want to give you where we're setting. There is Abram. Now, don't get that confused, because a lot of times we reference him as Abraham, and if you remember, at a later point after this chapter, Abram becomes Abraham. Now, Abram means father, and Abraham means father of many. And so it's essentially a further fulfillment of the promises that we've seen that God's giving, that Abraham is going to be a father of many, and God changes his name in order to do that. But so we got Abram right here. And Abram is also the father of the nation of Israel. If you've never known who Abram or Abraham is, he is the father. He is the one who's the first one who God chooses to build this entire nation out of. This nation that God works throughout the Old Testament, not just because they're them, but so that they can be a blessing to others. And who the line of Jesus comes through. It comes through the line of Abraham. So just getting a little big picture there. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to read Genesis 15, 1 through 3. And in this section, we're going to find this point here, that intimacy with God means we bring it all to the table. We admit the depth of our inadequacy to God. So when I read this, just follow along with me. Genesis 15, 1 through 3. After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, what can you give me, since I remain childless? And the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. All right, so let me give you a little context to this first, because when God shows up at the beginning in verse 1 and he says, Abram, do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield and your very great reward. That's usually something when God shows up and says that's comforting, that our first response would be, okay, yeah, all right, yes. But what's interesting is that when you read that, the response that Abram gives doesn't feel like a very warm one. It's actually those lines of going, you didn't give me this house. Now let's dive into the context here a little bit, because I want to give Abraham a little context here. Abram, in Genesis chapter 12, and I'm going to put up some verses here, it says this. God comes to Abram. Now at this point, Abram doesn't know God before. He's never walked with God before. He's in a different context. He's a moon worshiper. He's someone who's far off, who's not there. And God shows up in Abram's life, and he says this, Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all peoples of the earth will be blessed through you. And then further down in the chapter, it says this, that to your offspring I will give this land that he goes to. Now, Abram wasn't just kind of like a whiny guy who said, show me this first, and then I'll go. When God shows up to Abram and he says, go from your land to the land I'll show you, Abram doesn't have a GPS. God doesn't give him specific planned out instructions on how to do this. God simply shows up and says, go, and Abraham uproots himself. He uproots his family, his household. I mean, back in the ancient culture, that's everything to you. And these days, sometimes you can have one person off here and one person off there, but you get to fly in at different points. This is everything. This is their whole stability. This is his life, and he uproots it, and he just goes because God says to go. And he says specifically, to your offspring I'll give this land. This specific promise that says it is your children. It's going to be through you. And right before it, it says that Sarah is not able to have a child, and Abraham's not able to have a child. And so he believes, and he gets his hopes up, and he says, God, you've promised this. Yes, I will go. Yes, I will do this. But a long time passes since then. We're about 4 chapters in Genesis later, or 3 chapters later in Genesis. That's a while. There's a lot of things that have happened since then. He's uprooted, he's moved, he's gone all the way across the desert there, across the Mideast. He's moved, and he's uprooted his whole life, and he's been on this for a long time. And I imagine that in a lot of this, he's played the good, humble, like a trooper role, where he said, yes, all right, God, I'm going to do it. And he's still in the back of his head going, waiting for that child. I'd love him to come right now. I don't know. He's got that longing, that sense of probably feeling in the desert, that God's made promises to him, or God said things would happen, or God's reading through God's word. He sees that, and I wonder if you sometimes feel in the same place, where you might feel in that desert where God has said something, or where you thought something was going to happen and it hasn't, and you're working through it, and eventually it comes to a point where you can't be fake with God anymore, where you can't just pretend that everything feels perfect inside, when you really struggle and you're really questioning, and you thought you did everything that you were supposed to do. You uprooted your life. You did this, and nothing has happened. Another piece of this, too, is that the cultural context here, that when you read a passage in context, it adds so much more, because what is the deepest shame, or what is the worst thing that could happen to a male patriarch in this context? Is that he'd be childless. Why? Because then everything that he has worked, everything he has earned, and it says earlier in Genesis 14 that Abraham got pretty wealthy. He had silver, he had gold, he had enough resources to be able to like go into battle with people and win. Like, Abraham wasn't just a slouch over here. Abraham had resources, and no matter what his resources said, he couldn't handle them, or he couldn't pass them on without a child. In this context, that is everything. And the deepest shame that Abraham could have, the one thing that he can't control, and the one thing that he looks at himself and he says, I can't produce this, is to be without a child. And so when Abraham admits this to God, it's a sense of bringing his whole self to the table. His deepest shame. He's not bringing just like this peripheral thing. He's bringing his deepest shame and disappointment and inadequacy to God. Do you know? I moved ahead of myself a little bit there. Just hold on for a second. So he does do that, and his resources can do nothing. The reality of what happens next comes in Genesis 15, verse 4 through 6. In 4 through 6, he says this: Then the word of the Lord, in the middle of him bringing that transparency, the word of the Lord came to him, This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. He took him outside and said, Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said, So shall your offspring be. So he reaffirms this promise, and he meets Abraham's depth of shame that he brings to him, and he doesn't meet it in a sense that is accusatory. He doesn't take Abraham's shame and put it back on him. God's not that kind of God, who when you bring your shame, and when you bring the things that are really going on inside of you, the questions that you really struggle with, the things that you're working through, the things that you thought were going to happen and they didn't, God doesn't meet that with anything other than intimacy. Why? Because the ability to be transparent with God creates a moment for intimacy. The ability for you to be able to open up your deepest self creates that moment where God is able to look at you and say, I can work with you. Because you've been willing to open up yourself to God. You've been willing to share the deepest part of you. Do you know that you get to share your shame, your disappointment, and your inadequacy with God? Perhaps if you've been struggling with intimacy with God, perhaps it's because we haven't brought our full selves to the table. See, when I struggle with intimacy with God, a lot of times it's me, I think I'm bringing what I have to the table. I think I'm going, I'm just doing a lot of work, and so I guess that's why I'm not connecting with God, or I think I'm doing this, or maybe I'm just in this. But what I'm passing off, what I'm afraid to admit to God in the middle of it, what I'm afraid to tell him is going on is that I think that I can only earn his love by being someone, by being perfect for him. That's my deepest shame. The shame that Abraham brings is that he can't bear a child, and how is he supposed to do this? And God, you said this was going to happen, but my biggest shame in this is that I feel like I can only earn love from God by being perfect. So a question for us to ponder is what's your issue that you're keeping from God, that you might be masking as something else, that you might be masking and thinking, this is actually my issue, God. I'm going to bring this to you, when God says, go deeper. You got to go deeper, because that's not the core issue. The core issue is something much, much, much deeper. Now, another illustration here that I thought I was going to be able to get away without talking about this morning until I talked with Brother Harry in the office. And it became abundantly clear I needed to share this. There's a certain group of people of which I embody who we struggle to admit our shame. We struggle to admit that we're powerless. We struggle to admit that we're dependent on God. And I'm not trying to be political here in a sense of political parties, but I think everyone can see white evangelical American Christianity has not opened up ourselves, myself, to the fact that we have shame, to the fact that we're not dependent on God. Now, give me a second to back this up here, but everyone else can see that there's something going on here. It's like when you have that one friend that everyone else knows there's something going on, and there's something deep going on, and you can see it, but we can't see it. And we may even know that it's happening, but we don't know how to address it. We haven't gotten to the point where we've been willing to admit that we have that shame, that we have that struggle. As a construct, as a group, as a system, as a religious system, we don't know what intimacy with God is. And do you want to know why? What is shameful is that we don't know what it means to be fully dependent on God. And the reason why is because white evangelical American Christianity has never had to be dependent on God. We have never had to. Since we've been here, since white evangelical American Christianity has taken a role as a whole, since it has become something, it has been associated as a system with power, with dominance, and with resources. Resources of which were typically and most often found on the backs of other men and women made in the image of God. But we won't name that we struggle with that. We won't name that we've never been dependent on God fully. We think that our theological systems and our pew attendances and our ordinations are worth it to God. We think that they validate us. We think that, of course we've been dependent. And I'm not saying individual white people have not been dependent on God through situations where that is, but as a religious system, as a construct, we don't know what it means to be dependent on God at all. So we must admit this to ourselves. As white evangelical Christians, myself, and anyone else in here who's in that group. And the thing that we have to do after we go to God and we actually admit that is we begin to submit to communities and learn from those who do know what dependence on the God has looked like throughout their history, throughout life, and that we begin to learn from and submit. And what this looks like, one of the most distinct pictures I have, this is another thing I learned in my internship that sticks through. I want you to put a picture up. All right, yeah, that was it. So this group of people, I know Pastor G has used it before. This is a group of sharecroppers who are from from Missouri. If you are in this church, these are your spiritual ancestors. These are the people who the line through Pastor G's relatives and his grandparents are in here. This is the line of which we come from and we descend from as spiritual ancestors. These people knew what it meant to depend on God in the middle of everything, in the middle of oppression, in the middle of difficulty, in the middle of that. They knew how to depend on God and that they had power. They knew who they were because they knew that they were God's. If we as a people and myself, if white evangelical American Christianity can't come to understand that what's happening through the lineage and spiritual ancestry of these people, through the ancestry of this church, if I can't learn that and understand that we are dependent fully on that, we will never be healed. We will never be healed from the understanding that we don't have the intimacy with God that we look for. To be honest, that's why I'm here. I'm not here. And I've been learning, and I've learned to deconstruct this, but I'm not here as a minister and a pastor here primarily just to minister. I'm here because I have to learn. I have to be healed. I have to be healed by the spiritual ancestry of this church. I have to be healed in each and every single way here. And until I admit the shame that I still struggle to say this, that I can be confident in saying this here, but I still struggle with the ability to go and talk about this in context of white evangelical American Christianity, until I can wrestle with that myself, begin to do that, I still am learning. I'm still going. I'm still being healed in that process. I don't think you understand what God is doing at Fountain of Life. It is so important. It is so vital. And what God is doing here can truly change this nation. So that's point one. Woo! All right, anyone need to stand up for a second, just take a little break here? Here. But hear my heart. That number one is that we have to admit and bring our deepest shame. White evangelical American Christianity has to admit its deepest shame that it doesn't really have intimacy with the God because it's never needed to be dependent on him. For you, what's the question? What is it that you are afraid to bring to God? What is it that's shameful? What is it that's difficult to bring before God? Point number two comes that intimacy with God doesn't mean we won't have questions. It means we get to have conversation. You want to say it again? I think that's what I heard. Intimacy with God doesn't mean we won't have questions. It means we get to have conversation. I want to read this in the next few verses here, because remember, the last thing that was said was Abram believed the Lord and he credited it to him as righteousness. Now in verse 7, right after this, let's just not forget the intimacy of that moment that God had with Abram, that he walks him outside. That Abram's ability to be transparent creates this intimate moment where God gets to walk him outside and speak to him and remind him of the promises of who he is and remind him of the promises that God has made. And so Abraham believes and he has faith in him, but then immediately in verse 7 God says again, I'm the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to take possession of it. But Abram said in verse 8, Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? And so it's met with a question. Just because we have faith in God doesn't mean we don't have questions. And that's something that I think the church as a whole, we struggle with sometimes, or we feel like we can't ask questions to God, or we feel like God doesn't want our questions. God embraces real, genuine questions that come from a place of longing to know who God is and what he's up to. one of the things that I have experienced in the past year or two that's been overwhelming is that I've been interacting with lots of people who either have proclaimed they're not Christians or who've fallen away from the faith. I wasn't asking for that or anything like that, but I've been put in those situations a lot. And one of my really good friends shared this with me. He used to be a Christian growing up. He used to go to church every Sunday. He used to have faith in, and I actually never knew he was a Christian before I talked to him about this, but that he had used to have a religious background. But what happened is that as he continued to grow, he began to be curious about the things of God, curious about going deeper into the Bible, curious about how this world works in the midst of it. And so he would ask people at church, and he'd ask questions about, like, how does this go? And what he was met with was, don't ask those questions. He was met with, check out this verse. And he was met with a total disregard of his questions, his genuine, honest questions. Because what it would do is it would create insecurity in people. It would create insecurity in people's own relationships with God. And so what we don't realize is that when we are insecure in our relationships with God and we push that onto other people, we have a chance of pushing them away from their own intimacy with God. Because intimacy with God isn't meant on hiding yourself and hiding your feelings and your questions and your thoughts and the things you're wrestling through. Intimacy with God is about being able to express your full self to Him. Everything that you have. And so when we hide that, and when we instruct other people in our communities that they shouldn't be able to talk to God about what they're honestly going through, we prevent them from being able to experience intimacy. And as a church as a whole, not necessarily FOL, but in some places we do, but that's something that our generation has to fix. Our generation has to be willing to enter in, to be able to let people ask their full and deep questions, to embrace real, genuine things going on in people. When Abraham asked this, it's not out of a lack of faith. It's out of wanting to know God better. It's out of wanting to learn more about who He is. One of the best places that I find that this happens in this church, one of the favorite parts of this church is Bible study on Wednesday nights. If you're part of the group, you're already know where I'm going. But if you're not, you really should be there, because what happens in Bible study Wednesday nights is I'm so encouraged because people come and they bring their questions, they bring what they have. We've opened up a group where people are able to share what they have, their struggles that they're going through, the real, genuine, honest questions. And it comes from a place where we might be on this nice theological point. Let's say we're on an Old Testament passage, and we're talking about this great piece about the Old Testament in Israel, and yeah, we're working towards this point of who God is and all this, and it's nice and tidy. And then someone raises their hand and go, but why did the Canaanites have to be wiped out? We could say, don't ask that question. We could say, that's not in I don't see that. What verse is that? Oh, I don't see it, or anything like that. But we have real, genuine things going on in the text, in the scripture, that we don't understand sometimes, that we want to voice, or that we need to talk about. And a lot of times we push it away. And so what I'm so encouraged by with my observance in this church is in Bible study, we have an opportunity in a place where people can come and ask anything they need. And we don't have people who judge or people who go, don't ask that question. Or we might once in a while say, I had a nice point. As a teacher, sometimes it's really nice when you're working towards this point and something disrupting comes. But we need to be a community where we understand that having faith and intimacy with God isn't that we don't ask questions. It's that we get to have a conversation. God wants to converse with us about what's going on in our hearts and soul. Now, don't get me wrong. We have a holy and reverent respect for God in the middle of that. We don't just come to God with irreverency, and we are accountable to what we say. But God is looking for honesty. He's not like other gods who needs to be manipulated to be pleased. He is a God who wants your honest, full self, because that is where you become intimacy with God. As we continue, we got point 3 here. Intimacy with God is a one-sided gift. God chooses us. And it happens here in a walk to remember. If we continue in chapter 15, verses 9 through 11, it says this. So the Lord said to him, so let me go back to 8. Remember, he asked this question. Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? The Lord said to him, bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a pigeon. Interesting list. Then Abram brought all these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. Then birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. Now, this sounds like one of the weirdest scriptures you have ever heard. What on earth is going on? I'm supposed to know how this land's going to happen. How's that supposed to be? Bring me a couple animals, cut them in half, throw them apart. What is going on here? So again, get this picture. He's cut these animals apart. He's like, let's say they're one in this section of the aisle, one in this section of the aisle. Giving a little cultural context here. What actually did this mean? What did this look like? He didn't just randomly do this, but it's because he dove into what the context is. Do you love how personal God can be sometimes? When in the middle of your questions and you're struggling, and when you bring your full intimate self to him, he comes right down onto your level and speaks to you in a language that you understand. Maybe not everyone else understands, or maybe in their first glance they go, well, that looks kind of weird. I don't really know what's going on there. But you know, because you have an intimate relationship with God and he speaks directly to you. So he split these animals across this. What this would be, this is reflective of a covenant in the old days. Kind of like when you sign a lease, or you make a handshake and agree on something, except much more violent, much more bloody. I'm glad we don't have to do this today, but this is what it would look like, is that if we wanted, let's say you wanted to make a deal. Let's say one person's got a camel, I want that camel. One person wants this, and we're trying to make a deal. What we do is we split these animals like this, and the two people that want to make this deal both walk through the middle. They both walk through the middle together. And what that's supposed to symbolize is this. If I break my end of the deal, whoever it is walking through, if I break my end of the deal, may that be me. May this happen to me. May you do this to me. May this happen to me in any way. So the point is that this is serious. This is something where where these two people enter into a partnership together, and they say, I'm going to fulfill my end of the deal. I'm going to do it. We're going to do it. And if it doesn't happen, this happens. But there's something very, very different and very interesting about what happens to finish this. I'm going to read verse 12 and then 17 through 21 just to give, in light of time. It says this, and as the sun was setting, so remember, everything's like this, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Moving down to verse 17, when the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking fire pot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, to your descendants I give this land. And it goes on to list a bunch of ites, which, lots of ites. Lots of people in Canaan at this time. But what we can't miss here, sometimes we miss it the first place, is that what scholars say is that the Spirit of God descends and takes presence through these two items, a smoking fire pot and a blazing torch, and it turns into this walk to remember. Because where's Abraham in that case? Remember where we said you're supposed to both walk through together. In order for this promise to be fulfilled, in order for this intimacy to happen, in order for what's supposed to happen, you're supposed to walk through together. But what God says is, I'm going to put you in a deep sleep. I'm going to put you off to the side. It's not about you. It's not about anything you can do. I'm going to walk this to remember. I'm going to do a walk to remember. He walks down the middle of it, and he says what he says in effect is that I will never break this promise. I cannot be broken. My promises are not able to be broken. And I will put my entire self on the line here. And who ends up doing that for us? This is ultimately fulfilled in Jesus, who's willing to open his entire self up to who God is, who's willing to open his entire self, who's willing to give everything he has, who's willing to come out of heaven and embodied into a human, regardless of what we do, and he's able to open up his entire self to God. As the worship team, you can feel free to come up. Don't worry, just give me some background music going on here. I know how it works. I know you doubted me. The point we need to know today is this. When you bring your whole self to God, God does not reject you. God does not wish that you had said nice things to him or these perfect, phrasing when that's not what's going on inside. When God wants to hear what your heart really has to say. When God wants to hear your questions. And recognizing that your own resources aren't able to manufacture this. The point of why he walks through by himself is that he says, I alone can accomplish the things I've chose to accomplish in you. You will be a blessing to all nations. You will be a blessing because I have chosen to work through you. So if we don't remember anything else today, it's that we're remembering that in the middle of this whole idea of what I even said earlier about my own self and my own intimacy, thinking that God would look at me, that he'd look at the whole piece of me, not just the things that I like to show, not the things that I like to put up in front of people, that God looks at me in depth, and he knows already that I'm not perfect. He knows already that I can't create this on my own, that I'm not worthy of just myself, but he chooses me anyway. And today he chooses you. It doesn't matter what your past has said that you are. It doesn't matter whatever it is that is the most shameful thing that you have going on in your spirit right now. It doesn't matter what's going on in your life or what you have been. God chooses you. God chooses you. Intimacy is not found in what you bring to the table. Intimacy is found purely in God.